So let's get started. How about if we lower that expectation just a little bit and we can at least go through a good initial use case for how to start moving forward and why, and what we've been realizing in what's been going on internationally and here in the US. So there's a lot going on right now, and our market in transportation is really only the most recent of the industries to be disrupted in the way that really every other aspect of your life and company interaction is in the process of going through. So we're just the latest to have this happen, and we're trying to get ahead of what those growing expectations are, which affects everything from how we utilize our infrastructure to how we pay for that infrastructure to how individuals want to interact in their everyday life, because this is not a siloed solution. We're not just affecting how people get around their city. We're going to be affecting how deliveries are made, how you're able to do things like impact congestion and air quality measures. So all of these different approaches to what we can do are starting to be the basis of why mobility as a service exists and how we might be able to address all of these different changes through sustainability efforts, how technology is addressing those efforts, as well as the demographics of the people that we really need to be addressing the needs of. So mobility as a service is a combination of public and private transportation services in a given regional environment that provides holistic, optimal, and people-centered travel options to enable end-to-end journeys paid for by the user as a single charge, and which aims to achieve key public policy objectives. Now, those sound like a bunch of words, and a lot of people like to say MaaS is just so much that it's really difficult to understand how that applies to me and the portion of it that I can offer. In reality, it's not everything. It can be, but what MaaS does is layer a set of technologies provided by a variety of stakeholders. So each of those sentences actually relates back to a specific technology that you can stack on top of each other to be able to meet this greater end goal. Right now, in the US anyway, and I'll go with all of North America of this approach, so far, everyone's been focused on MaaS as an app, and that app contains journey planning. So I'm able to look and see all of the different options that might be in my area, and I can plan how to get from one area to another. And then real-time passenger information. And that really enables me to say which of those things are going to arrive on time, which one is going to meet my need for destination, whether that's based on the weather or when I need to be someplace or simply how I'm dressed that day. So all of those things affect the decision process that go into real-time information of which of those choices you're going to elect. And then really the cornerstone of all of this, the capability to pay for those services. And right now, a lot of those MaaS apps are utilizing a mobile ticketing framework to make that happen. The problem in this approach is it severely limits your ability in the public sector to be able to meet greater needs that are going to govern all of those changes that we started talking about on the first slide. So I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, MaaS is not an app, and people who have apps to sell have been promoting it as such. And what we're realizing in the actual execution of these projects worldwide is that an app is never going to be able to identify a policy objective for you to achieve. So those decision points have to be solved for more holistically than an app can provide. An app is the interface to make those things happen, how an individual is going to interact in your environment. And to some level, the US is going to have to create mobility as a service solutions in a way that meet people who don't have access to apps. So, as we have seen some of these projects unfold, there's definitely a diverging road of the public sector versus the private sector approach to what MaaS can do. And they're both important. So without minimizing either side of that spectrum, we see two models emerging. The first is a MaaS business model. And that's really the private sector approach so far that offers a subscription set of services. So predefined contracts that allow for an agency to offer either for full price or as a discounted package of services. What we're starting to see is in that package of services, if you elect for that kind of a subscription model that bundles, we're starting to see a walled garden around the data that impacts that action, which can mean that the public sector has a limited capability to use that package of services to benefit the greater societal good. So the approach that has been emerging that's the other side of that conversation is really the MaaS operating model. And that is how the public sector is approaching this problem set to build a stack of technology-based solutions that are able to give them that same user experience environment, but enables them to meet the needs of people that might not have a smartphone, or people who are unbanked or underbanked, people who simply don't want to have a subscription of services necessarily, maybe people who aren't using your system all the time, but on any given day might want to interact in a multimodal journey different than how they would say for just their commute. So it really starts expanding your network of services to new users. And that's really what MaaS can address. It's a bundling of the different types of infrastructure, including the provision of services within the public and private sector. So you might have a mobility service provider that's part of a private sector company, and mobility service providers that are part of a public sector company like public transit. What that MaaS operating model does is move from those siloed set of services to an integrated interoperability layer that allows them to give their customer that same level of experience. And in a given region, you might have a couple of different companies that are offering a MaaS business model. And that's fine, because people are going to start to use these services in the way that they want to originate that service. So you might have people that want to interact in their environment using a particular company's app. And that's okay, as long as you're offering an alternative that allows them to operate in that environment led by a public sector goal. So what we're actually talking about is the more realized international approach to this model. And this slide that you're seeing now is the MaaS maturity model. I did not create this. It's part of an international research study on how MaaS should actually be applied, and the link is at the bottom for the research paper that it's linked to. But what this does is provide a technology stack, a roadmap of technology systems that you're going to need to be able to really address that societal good. So you start with a level 0, which is arguably where most of North America is right now. We have single separate services. They're not integrated in any way. There are some cities that have moved up this stack, especially in the past 6 to 12 months. And a few months ago, APTA did a research study tour internationally to review some of these international projects. And what they really learned was the international approach is very much aligned to identifying a policy goal and making that end goal how they originate looking into each of these different kinds of offerings. So this is what I meant at the very beginning when we defined what mobility as a service is, that these are technologies that stack against whatever the end goal is that you identify. So very important first step is identifying a policy goal. Is that workplace access? Is it access to housing and development? Is it congestion management and mitigation? What is the end goal that your region is wanting to implement? And that's where you start from a goal standpoint, that level 4. What does that look like? And then you start layering technologies to meet that end goal. So at a level 1, you have multimodal trip planner with some pricing information. And so I can see that things exist, and that might help me make a better choice. But then when you get to a level 2, you're integrating booking and payment for a single trip. So maybe I can find, book, and pay for one kind of public transit service, and maybe that public transit has a bike share operation that they're contracted to. So I might be able to, for a single trip, offer a multimodal journey, but I can see it, I can book it, and I can pay for it. So that's partly what the mobile app part of this is. But if you stop at just offering an app, then you're at a full level 2. So that's not a bad place to start, but you can see you have to move up the stack if you want to reach full MaaS potential, which means identifying a policy goal. So then you start layering in things like a data management tool, as well as analytics to be able to know how people are using that network of services. And now you can start making more informed decisions from a planning standpoint and say, okay, we might have a company in our service area that's offering a packaged subscription level of services, and that's fine. But we want to be able to identify X, and whatever that X looks like in your area means you're going to start looking into how you contract those services. What does the customer interface look like? Who's responsible for the end management if something happens along that journey? So integration of the service offerings so that you can enable curbside management, so that you can start planning for workplace development and projecting into the future in a more holistic way. And that's how you start utilizing incentives and policies towards that ecosystem. So you can start nudging behavior through your policy choices. What that means is you're going to have to start engaging that conversation with stakeholder groups that are outside of your current level of control. A lot of times when people start talking about mobility as a service, they stop and say, I don't have authority to make those kinds of choices as the transit agency. And that might be true, which is why you want to start integrating with your DOT, with your MPO, and not looking at those as systems separate from your ability to control, but looking at them as partners in your ability to meet that end goal. So that means when you start looking at the technologies that have to be enabled in that ecosystem, you have open payments as account-based solutions that allow that ticketing to happen across. But big data, how you can use that process of tools to be able to make different decisions, real-time information. So far, some of that can all happen at the transit agency, but then you move into the stack of integrated transport management, and a lot of times that's the city or state DOT. So you want to start engaging them in the conversation because road user charging is becoming a more and more apparent solution moving forward to our stressed financial system for transportation. So you're going to want to start having those conversations sooner rather than later to build out a technology stack, whether you are the person contracting that service or not, and whether you have the legal or regulatory capability to make some of those decisions on your own. This is a true partnership approach. So stakeholder engagement and the ability to meet those needs is super important. And then you can also start doing things like involving the private sector who might already have some of those services. So parking and shared services with the companies that are starting to offer microtransit and micro mobility and curbside management and parking facilities, which is going to be a really important part of this mix. So not just public stakeholders, but public and private stakeholders outside of your current capability and decision-making set. So if you take those two and put them on top of each other, you can start to see the stakeholders that are required for you to build this technology set towards the capability of implementing that societal goal. So far, what we've seen is there's contracting conversations that have to happen. One of the biggest lessons learned is everyone agrees holistically that public transit has to be the backbone of a wholly capable system that includes mobility as a service. But there's very few regions that are going to be able to do that kind of selection of services overnight. That's why that maturity model becomes very important, because it gives you a roadmap of how to build it, incrementally addressing those changes. But so far, the private sector operators that are doing those bundling services, their target environment is maybe 10, 20, 30% of the overall population, which means you as the public sector are definitely going to have to address the remaining population. If this is done properly, we're going to be able to start affecting our environment in a more robust way. So we can do things like limit congestion, especially in the times where it matters most, but more effectively use our infrastructure to be able to manage capacity and give people different options, perhaps by that nudging. So we can have them travel at different times or for different reasons, utilizing a mix of those services and improving the overall customer experience by giving them the capability to make decisions regardless of their demographic or location-based options. So especially meeting the needs of those who need the most is one of the goals here. And then creating a model that is able to change how we are supporting our infrastructure, which could mean changing our funding system, but overall lessening our environmental impact. I think that we will stop there and allow some time for some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Crissy. We have a lot of questions coming in. One theme that we've heard from our viewers is what are kind of the initial first steps that an agency should take when implementing a MaaS program. Obviously, there are a lot of factors, different potential partners, whether that's a smaller bike share integration or scooters or TNCs. So what have you found in your experience has been a good, kind of initial action that agencies can take to pursue a MaaS pilot or program?
So one of the foundational technologies that you really need to have in order to operate this kind of an ecosystem is accurate and reliable real-time passenger information. So if you're talking about, I want an app that integrates with public and private partners, but you don't have the capability to track on time your buses and your rail, you're going to have a very difficult time implementing a system that becomes reliable in a way that people use. When I have conversations with a lot of these big companies who are wanting to enter into the North American market, they're shocked at the level of real-time information that's available. In many cases, something like the GTFS feed only provides a level of scheduled data. So depending on the transit agency, what they use to make some of those business choices may not be the most up-to-date information. So real-time actual information that shows occupancy and if there's detours that are part of your system of services. So there's a lot that goes into this that foundationally gets back to what transit does best, and that's provide dense service on a given framework. But if that framework doesn't have real-time information, it's very difficult to start building out the rest of that stack of services. So I would definitely recommend ensuring that you have that as a foundational layer of technology.
Got it. And this feeds right into another question, speaking about, open standards, not just in terms of data, but payment methods, which are such an integral part of MaaS. could you elaborate more on some of the types of systems that have to be implemented? One thing that an obstacle for some agencies are closed or legacy fare collection systems and lack of interoperability. In your experience, what are some good lessons that you've learned from regions who have been able to pursue an open payment system, and what does that look like both in the European and North American markets?
So open payments are pretty ubiquitous in pretty much every country internationally. North America is more limited. We're starting to see that change. There have been several procurements that have taken place over the past 18 months that are in the process of being delivered over the next 24 months that is going to shift those legacy systems in a really beneficial way. Every single one that I can think of required open APIs as a foundational layer to be able to connect interoperably with that public and private set of systems. The problem with that, as we're seeing in what has actually been executed internationally in MaaS projects, is an open API only answers the technical capability to connect to those systems. It does not predefine a policy reason for wanting to do any particular kind of service, nor does it allow you a contracting methodology or a settlement methodology to know how that payment happens across a multitude of projects, how that individual user interacts if something goes wrong on that system. So if I took a bike share to the rail and I went to go to my reserved bike and it wasn't there and it made me late and now I missed my bus or rail, who's responsible for interacting with the individual? What we're really starting to see is this is not a technology problem. This is really a business management problem. And the contracts are a very big piece of what has to be decided in order to interact in that environment. And definitely the ability to process payments is obviously going to be a foundational part of that. So account-based systems, if I could make a recommendation of what you need to move to in order to make that happen, many of the systems right now, large or small, there's many that are card-based, and that card base makes it very difficult from a technology standpoint to move into paying multiple entities because there is a limited capability to access that fund. So as we start moving forward, we project that there's going to be more ubiquity around account-based payment systems, and open APIs definitely give that interoperability capability, but it's not going to answer the overall policy guidance that needs to be asked before you start implementing services. And it also needs to be able to be addressed in a more business management approach where you're going to have a lot of people come in and out of this space. And so how they interact in your environment are business decisions that partly need to be made at the regional level. How do you want the responsibility of the customer? And I say responsibility because I don't think anybody owns a customer. The customer is going to choose who they want to interact with and when. So we have a responsibility to make a system that connects services, that shows them who they interact with when any one of those things goes wrong. And sometimes if they want to just say when something's going right, who do they call when they have to make those choices?
And also on that point, we have a lot of questions about equity, and I know you mentioned in your presentation, particularly being able to provide access to MaaS services platforms for folks who are unbanked. And so we had a couple questions about, when you have an account-based system and have a lot of potential for mobile payments, what are some ways besides mobile phone payments that riders and users would be able to access, say, something like a scooter or hail a rideshare ride. In a lot of these cases where, for example, with scooter parking, photo validation is a huge component. So what are some alternate methods in terms of expanding equity that you've seen in successful cases that may or may not require, having to install specific hardware or a card reader onto, multiple private providers' existing fleets or equipment?
So that's about 20 different questions. I'll start. I'll start at the payments piece, because I think from an equity standpoint, that's one of the questions I get a lot. So when you move to an account-based system, you can still have a card associated with that account, meaning you can start integrating with internal and external bodies. So bike share, as an example, that you can pay for that bike share with your card. There are some instances where that is happening, but the payment for those things comes out of an account that's tied to a person. So right now, I would say the best example of how to expand that system of services to be able to allow people to reload value, to be able to make the decision where they are at that moment, is actually through LA Metro's TAP efforts. They have a retail network, and there are similar examples in other cities, but by expanding your retail network of services, you're essentially allowing for your commercial environment that is near your transit services to become resellers of your service, but in a way that can still be based in an account that ties back to an individual. So you can reload at the 7-Eleven and be able to pay a person with cash, but you could still use that card itself to unlock a bike share. So those technological capabilities exist and are going to be a good way of interacting in that environment. I will say things like scooters are going to be a much more difficult conversation moving forward, because their legal requirements are quite different. They have city by city regulation that says things like, you have to show a user upfront what our regulations are to be able to operate that scooter. And then you have to show them again 2 days later or a week later, and then you have to show them again if it's their third ride. There are all of these regulations that different cities have required in different ways. But if that engagement that is continuous to give information that really keeps the system safe, the people that are using that system, it makes it more difficult to interact with people that don't have a piece of hardware, a phone or whatnot, that allows them to interact. So there are definitely equity-based conversations that have to continue to be addressed. And some of those companies have really been trying to address those questions themselves. So they're partners in this, trying to meet that need. There aren't a lot of examples internationally of everything they're doing to meet equity, namely because most other nations don't have things like Title VI. So they don't have some of those requirements. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of the rest of the world is actually eyes on the US of how we are going to address some of these problems. Because even if they don't have a law or a regulation that requires it, they still want to address the needs of their public. So if they don't have a good answer, as we continue to roll out these systems, we do have the regulatory and legal requirement to solve for these things. I think that they're kind of looking at us to help them make some of these solutions as well. It's not an easy path forward, but there are foundational elements that you can build your technology in a way that gives you that roadmap.
Got it. Well, that's a great stopping point. It looks like we are out of time, but thank you so much to Crissy for a very informative and high-powered session, and for sharing a lot of your insights about mobility as a service. As you mentioned, a lot of eyes are on the US and looking at how these programs are implemented, and how folks like Cubic are involved, and agencies across the country. Eno will be staying involved and engaged on these issues. We recently just released a paper working with from the MOD Sandbox project about lessons learned about contracting transit agencies contracting with private providers, and lessons learned from the, as you mentioned, LA Metro and Puget Sound partnerships with VIA as part of the Sandbox project, and we'll be having a paper on data sharing soon. So a lot of folks engaged on this topic, and definitely encouraging all our viewers to stay engaged and stay tuned for updates going into the new year. Again, thank you so much, Crissy, for sharing your insights. We all look forward to staying engaged, and thank you all for joining our webinar today.